Karl Theodor zu Guttenberg calls out Vladimir Putin in a recent opinion piece for Time magazine. Plus, we'll follow up on the escalation of violence in the Middle East now that President Obama's policy of disengagement is in full swing. That and more on today's Trumpet Daily.
The Philadelphia Church of God presents the Trumpet Daily.
On yesterday's program, I referred to what my father's been saying recently about Vladimir Putin and the emergence of Russia as a world power and how that all these events, particularly more recently with what's happened in the Ukraine, how that these events are just going to accelerate the pace of prophetic events in Europe as well. As Russia gets stronger, as we noted yesterday, Europe's going to go looking for that king of fierce countenance, as it says in Daniel chapter 8. They're going to want a strong man to rival what they see in Russia. So with that in mind, you can see why this particular article set off a few alarm bells in our headquarters offices today, because it's about Vladimir Putin and his bullying tactics. And it's written by Karl Theodor zu Guttenberg, this man that we've been watching carefully. The article title is "Putin is Basking in an Astonishing Leadership Vacuum." That's what Guttenberg writes. And Guttenberg, as you know, if you've been following us for very long, he's the former defense minister for Germany. And he's one that we've watched closely as a possible candidate to become this prophesied strongman in Europe. Brad McDonald wrote an article that we posted today at thetrumpet.com in response to this opinion piece that was printed in Time magazine just yesterday. So go to the Trumpet and make sure you get Mr. McDonald's analysis on this event, this article on the events in Russia. I just want to go through a few of the key quotes from Guttenberg's article. He talks about how really over the past year, Putin has, as he said, bedeviled the West. And he writes, when it comes to the honorable title of Bully of the Year, the Russian president surely triumphed in 2013. But all too often, he writes, bullies fail with their homework. Russia's economy is crumbling. And he spends a paragraph or two talking about the economy or the situation in Russia internally and how it's not that good. We brought out this same point yesterday. Russia has its problems, as I noted, but they also have a real strong man at the top. And he's not afraid to show strength, particularly in a world where no one's standing up to him. And I think that's basically what Guttenberg's doing here with this article. He's urging Europe to stand up to Putin. It says in the article, a somewhat overlooked aspect of the contest over Ukraine is the role Berlin has played in it. Germany is the country that has often emphasized the importance of building bridges to Russia and has come up with policies like change through rapprochement. I mean, Germany's trying to build bridges, he says. We're trying to make peace. But by now, Putin's zero-sum game mentality and hard power push have provoked even the otherwise not so confrontational German chancellor to take action. In other words, Germany is being roused to action, even with a non-confrontational chancellor, as he puts it. Now, what will happen once they receive a chancellor who is confrontational, who will confront? The Bible says he's coming. This strong man, this king of fierce countenance, as Daniel called him. Continuing in the quote, it says, while scoring a probably Pyrrhic victory, Putin has alienated an important partner. Ironically, he also achieved what no pleas from the U.S. president or fellow European leaders could do. Germany finally assumed leadership on a difficult foreign policy issue. I mean, countries in Europe have been urging Germany to do this. America has been urging Germany to do this. And now Putin As Guttenberg rightly points out, he's achieved what other nations haven't been able to achieve. That is, he's egging on Germany. Of course, he's not encouraging them to become more powerful. It's his belligerent actions that's really bringing this about. Mr. MacDonald, in his article, writes about that term Pyrrhic victory and how it really has to do with Guttenberg saying there's going to be consequences here for these actions that Putin is taking. There's payback coming. He's drawing a line in the sand. The article says the primary reason for Putin's self-aggrandizing behavior is the astonishing leadership vacuum in the world. Washington's recent preference to let other nations, including Russia, lead on international affairs has eroded the U.S.'s authority. However, the U.S. seems to slowly realize now that to influence Putin, it must speak his language, that of power. It's an amazing article here, really. I mean, Guttenberg sees the astonishing weakness in Washington. He sees this astonishing leadership vacuum around the world. And he's calling for leadership to stand up to Putin because he sees how Putin's taking full advantage of this vacuum. And notice that he also points out there that the only language that Vladimir Putin understands is the language of power. The language of power. How can anyone not see where this is leading? If you just look at events as they're transpiring, as my father pointed out over the weekend, they're moving along now at lightning pace. One more quote, it says, "As for Europe, it finally seems to recognize that it needs to be capable of taking care of its own neighborhood. The frozen conflicts in the post-Soviet space have been ignored for too long." He says Russia's behavior toward Ukraine might hand Europe an opportunity to become more united and effective in its foreign policy. Now, who's been telling you this all along? We've been saying this, that Europe is going to become more united. It's made up of an unstable mixture now with all the 27, 28 nations, iron and clay, as Daniel 2 says. But be assured, there is iron there. There are 10 kings or 10 groups in Europe that will rally together once that strong man is in place and comes in with all those flatteries, all those smooth-sounding words. You can see some of that in this article written by Guttenberg. He wrote it with another individual who happens to be a Russian chess player who's been very outspoken in his criticism toward Vladimir Putin. In the February Trumpet, the issue I referred you to just a while back, the one with Putin on the cover, King of the East, as it says there, my father wrote that Putin's behavior there in the Ukraine is rattling Europeans to their core. The leaders in Europe, they're shaken by this man's actions, by this man's overreach, the way they see it. Quoting from that issue, the article in here, by the way, the feature is my father's From the Editor piece, Is Vladimir Putin the Prophesied Prince of Rosh? Goes through Ezekiel 38, the prophecy over there. And as I say, it's the February issue, but that article on the Prince of Rosh was posted back in December. My father writes, America is sleeping through the Ukraine crisis, but Europe is deeply alarmed by what happened to this country that is right in its own neighborhood. The changes this crisis provokes in Germany and Europe will shake the nations. He says the Ukraine debacle has taken us a giant step closer to World War III. And then at the end, he warns us to watch what's happening in Russia and particularly how Europe responds. And he talked about it over the weekend. I reminded you of it yesterday. And then, as if right on cue, here comes Guttenberg's article last night at Time magazine, talking about the astonishing leadership vacuum and how Putin's taking advantage of it and how someone needs to stand up to him. Someone will, and probably soon. Verse 40 of Daniel 11, it says, "At the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind." This talks of that clash between Europe and radical Islam. I'll talk more about that after the break here, or at least the king of the south. But here is this emerging power in Europe, the king of the north, and you can go and read the other verses. We've gone through a lot of this before. But look at verse 44. It says, "But tidings," this is again how the king of the north, or the European power, reacts. "But tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go forth with great fury to destroy and utterly make away many." Now this is projecting ahead to the time of the Great Tribulation. And after this spectacular clash between the king of the north and radical Islam, then during those tribulation years, then the king of the north, or the European power, is going to lash out at the kings of the east, because they see what's going on over there and it makes them nervous. I mean, you could even look into history and see that Europe is constantly looking over its shoulder at what's going on in Russia. And you can bet they're doing it now, given the rise of Putin. To quote from Mr. McDonald's article, the one he posted today, referring back to this opinion piece that Guttenberg just wrote, he said, Gutenberg, the title is Guttenberg versus Putin, a battle of the titans. He says, "Time will tell, but this article could mark the opening bell of a dramatic and prophetically significant battle between two heavyweight world leaders." This could be the opening bell, he says. Time will tell, we'll see, I'm sure, in the months ahead. All right, we'll be right back.
Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008 marked the beginning of a dangerous new era in history. Since this attack, Vladimir Putin's Russia has become more aggressive than ever before. Recently, Ukraine has decided to back out of talks to join a European trading bloc. The decision came after a visit between Russian President Vladimir Putin and Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych. The announcement led to massive protests in the Ukrainian capital of Kiev. Earlier this year, Putin convinced the United States to cancel plans to build a missile defense system in Eastern Europe. Putin was also able to sway Kyrgyzstan to kick America out of its Manas airbase. Vladimir Putin is rebuilding the Russian Empire, and Europe is deeply alarmed. End-time prophecy speaks of a conglomerate of Asian nations known as the Kings of the East. This power is going to amass an army of 200 million men. At the head of this mighty army is a man the Bible identifies as the Prince of Rosh. Could Vladimir Putin be that man? Download our free reprint article, Is Vladimir Putin the Prophesied Prince of Rosh? Also, request a free copy of Russia and China in Prophecy. Both can be obtained at thetrumpet.com.
Yesterday we also talked to you about the fall of Fallujah there in Iraq, and how that we left that nation, the United States forces did, in 2011. And basically, what's filled the power vacuum there? Well, quite a few terrorists have flooded into the region. A little over a week ago, there was a national security estimate that came out, I think right there at the end of December, that predicted that once the U.S. pulls out of Afghanistan, that's coming at the end of this year, that once that happens, then the Taliban is ready and set to reclaim all of the territory that it lost over the last many years in its war with the United States. So you see, and our national intelligence estimate is predicting it already. And so what we're looking at is a similarly disturbing outcome in Afghanistan. We're seeing it happen right now in Iraq. This is what Con Coughlin said at the Telegraph. January 6th, he said, and so if the NSE's prediction, the NSE, that's the security estimate, if the NSE's predictions prove to be accurate and the Taliban retake all the territory vacated by the withdrawing American and British troops, then Afghanistan, which was supposed to be Obama's war, will turn out to be the single greatest foreign policy disaster of the Obama presidency. That's what we're looking at. He says if that happens, even Democrat voters will be asking whether the sacrifices made by the thousands of American service personnel who have been killed or suffered serious injury in the Afghan conflict were in vain. Even Democratic voters are going to be asking if it was all in vain. This was supposed to be President Obama's war. He said very little about Iraq because that was Mr. Bush's war, supposedly. But now it's going to be basically the same outcome. In Afghanistan, we talked about Leviticus 26:20 yesterday, where God said that our strength would be spent in vain. It's not just these commentators. I mean, 2 senators just last week, Senators McCain and Graham, also said people are going to be wondering if this was all done in vain. These families of the soldiers and such. Isn't that amazing? Just as God said it would be. From the Washington Post, also January 6th here, talking about this escalation in violence and all these Sunnis flooding into regions like Syria and Iraq because of, in the case of Iraq anyway, the vacating presence of America. It says an eruption of violence in Iraq is threatening to undo much of what U.S. troops appeared to have accomplished before they withdrew, putting the country's stability on the line and raising the specter of a new civil war in a region already buckling under the strain of the conflict in Syria. You know about what's happening in Syria, and it could be coming in Iraq. Now that we're gone, it says, in the western Iraqi province of Anbar, Sunnis are in open revolt against the Shiite-dominated government of Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki. Says militants affiliated with al-Qaeda have taken advantage of the turmoil to raise their flag over areas from which they have been driven out by American troops, including the powerfully symbolic city of Fallujah, where U.S. forces fought their bloodiest battle since the Vietnam War. That was back in 2004. Again, I told you about some of this yesterday, but it was just 10 years ago. And now the flag of al-Qaeda is flying over the city of Fallujah. Now that article in the Post there goes on and points out how the Obama administration is responding by sending more weapons or promising to send more weapons and surveillance drones to the Iraqi government. And the amazing thing about this development is that in doing so, the United States basically is backing the position of Iran, which is tied very closely together with the Shiite government in Iraq. And what a change. I mean, here we started the war against terrorism after 9/11 and went after all these other areas, as my father and the Trumpet.com pointed out, everywhere except Iran, the #1 state sponsor of terrorism. All along they were given a free pass, and not that relations were necessarily good between the United States and Iran, but as we noted there at the very start of the war against terrorism, if the United States didn't go after the head of the snake, it wasn't going to deal with the problem. It would just be like putting a Band-Aid on an open flesh wound. It wouldn't solve the problem. And so here we are, and now it's just an entangled mess in the region, and any side that you choose is the wrong side, and evacuating is the wrong choice as well. It's everything the United States does. It just seems like it's backward or upside down. Just on Sunday, Secretary of State John Kerry, he made comments about how that Iran could be more of a player in making peace in Syria. He's urging Iran to play the role of peacemaker in Syria. The nation that Iran is backing, its government, the Assad regime, and funding and supplying it with weapons. Imagine the #1 state sponsor of terrorism being courted by the United States to come in and play the role of peacemaker. That's how upside down this world is. That's how childish the leadership is in Washington. And the New York Times came out with an interesting piece just this morning, and probably partly in defense of what Secretary of State Kerry said, last week about the article on Benghazi, where they revised all the history and just trying to defend the administration, and I think Hillary Clinton in particular, to get her ready for her presidential run here in a couple of years. But the Times came out with this piece today titled, "U.S. and Iran Face Common Enemies in Mideast Strife." Well, all of a sudden we're facing the same enemies, and so there can be an alliance now, the Times suggests. It opens by saying, even as the U.S. and Iran pursue negotiations on Tehran's nuclear program, they find themselves on the same side of a range of regional issues surrounding an insurgency raging across the Middle East. It says, while the two governments quietly continue to pursue their often conflicting interests, they are being drawn together by their mutual opposition to an international movement of young Sunni fighters who, with their pickup trucks and Kalashnikovs, are raising the black flag of al-Qaeda along sectarian fault lines in Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Yemen. It says here, finally, the United States, reluctant to intervene in bloody, inconclusive conflicts, is seeing its regional influence decline, while Iraq, which cost the Americans $1 trillion and more than 4,000 lives, is growing increasingly unstable. And so the U.S.'s influence is in sharp decline, and we're left with trying to find an alliance here or there, even when it's with traditional enemies. Now, I don't have time to go into the Psalm 83 alliance, but basically, as we've been telling you for many years, that whole region is going to fall along two very distinct camps. You've got the pro-Iranian camp, and then you've got the pro-Saudi camp. And what we're seeing here, reading the New York Times piece and other things that are coming out in the news, is that the United States basically has chosen to back the Iranian camp, at least in areas like Iraq. It's a confusing mixture in many ways, but the United States is now backing Iran, which is working to get a bomb so that they can blow up Israel. That's the world that we live in. Now, eventually, America is going to be completely out of the equation altogether. Look at what we just read there in Daniel 11 and verse 40 about this clash, this coming clash between Europe and radical Islam. When German-led Europe goes down there and wipes out the head of the snake, that's going to be Iran. And in this prophecy, Daniel 11:40, you don't see anything mentioned there about the United States. This decline in power and influence in the region will eventually lead to us having nothing to say or do in that area. But of course, the German-led beast power will have a lot to say about it. This New York Times piece goes on and says, with Iran as an island of stability in the region. Can you believe that? The New York Times pointing to Iran as the so-called island of stability. It says, critics of the United States policy say that the Obama administration is strengthening Iran at the expense of traditional allies, particularly Saudi Arabia and Israel. They say Iran has not cut back on its support of its regional allies, like Hezbollah, the militant Shiite group in Lebanon, and Mr. Assad, and is deeply involved in Iraq's Shiite government. I mean, those criticisms are true. They're valid. It's a tinderbox, and it's about to explode. And when it explodes, well, it's described in Daniel 11 and verse 40, and that explosion is going to trigger all kinds of cataclysmic events around the world. So this is why we keep such close watch on that region, and also, as we've been telling you about repeatedly here in the last few weeks, what's happening in Russia, China, the kings of the East there, and then also this beast power to arise out of Europe. So make sure that if you haven't already subscribed to the Trumpet magazine, of course you know about the trumpet.com and the Trumpet Weekly that we send out through email each Friday, but this magazine also comes out and goes right to your mailbox every month, and it's completely free of charge. We offer it without cost and no obligation to you. We want to give it to you freely, so sign up today if you haven't already. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you again next time on the Trumpet Daily.